they're trying, and I think that's the important part. And again, so post-COVID conditions have been normalised again, and it is problematic that the workers themselves are taking on this work of improving their own conditions, but at the same time, I do feel that they have a level of responsibility to do so. They are innovating and have a sense of negotiating power and a feeling of responsibility for those in their department. So all of us argue that solutions should be sought in collaboration with workers, and there's always a danger of running into sort of extractive ways of mining them to fix their own industry, but actually at the same time, workers are the people who most want change are the workers themselves. So where can those energies be directed to create that change? That's me. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, was that me, Rowan?
Christa next.
Oh, yes. I thought so.
You want me to share now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
I'm hopefully. Have I done that? Has that been successful?
Yes.
What the heck? Hang on a moment, got to find me rest of it. Okay, so cool. I'll try and do this in the time, which is a bit yeah, so I'm going to talk about a piece of work that we did a little while ago about bullying in the industry, and yeah, so it follows on very well from Tiffany's, I think. So bullying in the television industry has been quite a high profile business. There have been a few high profile cases, and it's still going on. It's been going on a while. It still goes on. But there is a danger that because of this and because of some of the names involved, it all starts to be seen in terms of these bad apples. Whereas in fact, the concern and the thing that makes it concerning is that this is very, very widespread in a rather more boring, low level, ongoing way than you would think from the slightly more sort of sexy, high profile press coverage. We did a survey in 2021 called State of Play, which we did for Beck2, looking at management practices. And in that survey, 93% of television professionals, actually it was more than 93%, but because of the way the data was presented, a minimum of 93% of professionals had experienced or witnessed bullying, harassment in the workplace. And even more worrying, the Film and Television Charity survey in the same year found 57% had been subjected to bullying, harassment or discrimination that year. And that was just after COVID. So attitudes have changed. I mean, I think we have to recognise this. Only 10 years ago, Kathy John did a study that found that not only were the creative industries a hotspot for bullying compared with other places, but there was this kind of pervading climate of acceptance that, you know, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen kind of attitude. Whereas in 2023, there definitely is a recognition that television's got some problems. But again, I would reiterate, there does tend to be this tendency to foreground individual perpetrators and also to focus on whistleblowing schemes, basically, of any kind, which in itself is good. I mean, it's good if people feel they can report, although we'll come back to whether that's really happening, but doesn't exactly prevent the problem happening in the first place. And there's definitely a general reluctance to frame the problem as systemic, as actually completely endemic to the way the industry is structured, despite the fact that there's a huge amount of evidence, particularly from organizational psychology, that basically confirms the part played by working environments and jobs design on the likelihood of bullying. And we, my research partner and I, Richard Wallis, we like to think of this in terms of risk factors. And the risk of workplace bullying occurring is greatest where workload's very high and it's mentally demanding work, where teams work under pressure to tight schedules, so roles are not clearly defined, and where people are subject to conflicting demands from different directions, competing hierarchies, different structures of control, where there's poor communication, where issues that do arise aren't addressed, and there's a lack of regular feedback, where employees feel that their employer is not to be trusted to behave fairly. And most critically, probably, the job insecurity makes it very difficult for people to report concerns. I would have run out of space if I tried to indicate all of the studies that come together to demonstrate these things, but anybody who knows anything about work in telly will recognise this list as a very good description of the television industry. A note on leadership and management as well. The risk of bullying is moderated by good leadership and is exacerbated by bad. Again, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And in this case, mainly good leadership is being characterized as what Bassers called transformative leadership. So the main characteristics being regular constructive feedback, professional development opportunities, positive role models, addressing issues and conflicts that come up before they escalate. And again, there are destructive, what are called by Skogstad and Einarsson and people, destructive leadership practices, which include actively destructive behaviour to leadership, bullying leadership, but also passive and avoidant leadership, what's called laissez-faire leadership. Both of these exacerbate the risk of bullying, not just in as much as managers may be in a position of perpetrating bullying behaviours, but perhaps more importantly, that managers' behaviours create the culture and create the environment within which bullying thrives. So how we got involved in this, we did a survey called State of Play in State of Play 21, Management Practices Unscripted Television, which we did for Beck2. There were a number of multiple choice questions. There were a decidedly unwise number of open-ended text questions. We hadn't quite registered that if you provide an unrestricted text box to people in telly and ask them what they think about management, you'll get 400 versions of War and Peace. People took a long time completing this. People felt strongly enough about these issues to spend well over half an hour writing War and Peace. We got very high number of responses this survey. 88% of them were freelancers and 70% had management responsibilities of their own. It was not set up as something about bullying, but bullying emerged as a really key theme. So just to sort of run through a few of the findings, there were shocking extreme examples. We tended not to use those in the report which we wrote about this, partly because of anonymity, because the more extreme examples, frankly, have the kind of details in them that would compromise the anonymity of our respondents, but also because actually the extreme examples in a funny sort of way sort of confuse the issue, because it's the widespread and broadly tolerated nature of bullying in the industry that is perhaps really the most shocking thing. And partly because freelance staff are too frightened to criticise the person who might well be important in getting them the next gig. Reports of culture of fear, blame culture, toxic workplaces were absolutely endemic, and I thought it was significant that a number of respondents commented that this was not that this was in some cases completely deliberate. Sometimes it was an accumulation of other factors, but there are a considerable number of people in the industry who think this is a good way of getting good performances out of people. But there was also a lot of just general incompetence, micromanagement, which was often actually a symptom of a lack of confidence in managers, and a lot of miscommunication, and a lot of behaviour which managers themselves wouldn't recognise as bullying probably, but which had that effect on the people on the receiving end. So, right, oops. Sorry, I just realised why I skipped that. Whoops, right. So we use San Ho's way of trying to make sense of this tsunami of data that we were dealing with, and we put our findings into 3 areas. Risks. Oh, so background noise suddenly. Risks associated with job design and work organisation, those associated with organisational cultures and climate, and those associated specifically with leadership and management. In terms of job design and work organisation, probably the biggest issue was to do with workload, just the number of hours that people were doing, which creates a sort of whole level of stress and a situation where instances of bullying are more likely to arise. And the idea as well of a kind of flexibility on behalf of workers always, never on behalf of the organisation they're working for, of course. And the assumption that people are just going to show up as and when at all times and places as required. And there's almost literally no limit on what can be asked of people. Cognitive demands, of course, are a really big part of the work in television. Most people working television probably wouldn't have a problem with that. But there's a very well established HR model called the demand control model that basically says if the demands are high and your sense of control is low, you're going to have some serious problems. There needs to be an appropriate balance. And the sort of people calling up at 10 o'clock at night basically doesn't fit well with that. Micromanagement was a big problem as well, again, often to do with a lack of management training on behalf of people doing it. And yes, whistleblowing was sometimes theoretically allowed, but in practice not, because people are freelancers and you never know who's giving you a next reference. Organisational culture and climate, the big things were what might broadly be called poor time management. A lot of this goes back to the flexibility issue. If you can call on people all times, day and night, to do anything, and they've all signed off their rights to a 48-hour week, you don't have to think about time management. It's noticeable that in scripted TV, because you're looking at unscripted, there is less of an issue with this because you've got to work around actors and a lot of crew who are working overtime if you go over and you shoot, so you actually plan properly. Senior people are terrible communicators. That's quite ironic in telly, of course. So poor communication was a big problem. And this issue of perceptions of fairness and blame culture are really, really important, because the way that people behave will depend very much on what they perceive to be acceptable behaviour and what they perceive to be their recourse and their chance of success if they raise an issue. The quote here is of an absolutely classic case, a case of sexual harassment and bullying. It was reported, evidence was put together, and the company used it to keep the person on but blackmail them into taking a lower rate, which is, you know, just, there's no words. Leadership and conflict management obviously was the other area here. So generally good management wasn't felt to be a common practice. Regular constructive feedback is a sort of mythical thing, I think, to a lot of people who work in television. As is professional development. There's very little opportunities on something very contract based to do a lot of formal training, but informal development opportunities are problematic when everyone's working to such a tight schedule and under pressure and without any real understanding of management roles to give people a break, help to support them. People are supposed to arrive the finished item at all times, and just sort of, the idea that you might give people feedback and they might improve in some way is almost not a thing. there are many positive role models, I think, in terms of brilliant creatives, but positive role models as managers, I think, have to be sought with, yeah, with some energy. And again, this idea of addressing issues that arise. Several white senior people talk to us about the fact that that's not really a thing, and if somebody turns out not to be great in their job, well, you just try and ignore them and ask somebody else to do it till their contract runs out, let them go and never tell them why. That seems to sort of be the preferred method of dealing with that. So we, came to the conclusion that we were definitely not looking at a few bad apples here. We were looking at systemic problems that needed to be approached systemically, and the risks inherent in an awful lot of the environment of television work need to be managed as any other risk. And there's sort of three main areas of action. Changing the culture, providing tools for managers and also for employees to avoid and address bullying, and recognizing and managing those underlying structures. Now, it's interesting, and a lot of this overlaps a great deal with what Tiffany was saying, I think. There are changes to the culture. There is a lot of awareness raising. Bectu's Unseen on Screen is an example. Tiffany gave us some others. People are talking about stuff and saying, well, this isn't on. The BFI has bullying guidelines. BAFTA has been quite I think quite strong in this area to some degree. People turn up and say, I've been bullied on a show that was nominated. It gets unnominated for a while till it's sorted out. That puts them in quite a powerful position. So there has been some engagement with that. Tools, maybe not quite as strongly. There are, didn't mean those to be three. So there's some engagement with whistleblowing schemes, and there's this new independent standards authority, and the FTVC has a sort of hotline for bullying. Again, there's still a big problem when you're talking about freelancers. And again, whistleblowing schemes are designed to deal with the bullying afterwards rather than prevent it happening. Of course, they also serve a kind of symbolic function because they signal the fact this isn't okay. We don't accept this in this industry. And that in itself, I think, is a positive thing. But tools for managers, less so. There are some new HR tools just appeared that skill sets produced. I don't know how useful people are finding them, maybe, I don't know. But management training is also pretty much unavailable to pretty much everybody working in television production at the moment. So there is some recognition, but really taking that one on and seizing it is yet to happen. Very limited engagement with the underlying risk factors, very limited engagement by, if you like, the sort of television bosses, that the workloads and the precarity and other of these major risk factors are just that, risk factors. Television is very good at risk. It's very good at managing risk in health and safety. It's very good at managing legal risk. They understand managing risk doesn't necessarily mean not doing a thing at all. It might just mean you're doing it, but you've got to be careful how. Since the 80s, people still take aerial shots. It's just when they lean out of helicopters, they wear a safety harness. And that is something that the industry really, we think, has to engage with a little bit more. And I think that's me, and I think I did it in time.
Did. Thank you, Christa.
Yay.
Jilly, are you all right with the sharing, Jilly?
Yes, I should be, if you give me 30 seconds, hopefully, just to get it up on the screen. Okay. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Yeah, just while that's loading up, I should just say I'm at my parents' house and there are various dogs around and about, and I've tried to keep them away, but if there is barking at some point, I can only apologise. So yeah, hopefully this will be up there in a second. Yeah, and just to say that those two talks so far have been brilliant in setting up some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, particularly questions about individual responses to systemic problems. I think that ran through it, Tiff's talk, Christa's talk, and that's definitely something that that I'm going to be talking about too. So okay, so what I'm going to talk about really today is I'm just introducing a new project which hasn't begun yet. It's due to start October 1st of this year, and so I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Professor Helen Wood and Dr. Jack Newsinger. So we're part of a project team that's just got AHRC funding to do the project on reality television and duties of care. So we're very excited about starting this project, but we are right at the beginning. Well, we haven't even started, so we're actively welcoming insights, feedback, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say about this. I should also say as well, just sort of a little shout out, that there are going to be 3 postdocs advertised for this project. So if you know anybody that's just about finished their PhD and would like to sort of do a postdoc in this area, then please get them to get in touch with us. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief content note that there will be some brief but fairly frequent references to mental health, brief reference to eating disorders, and a few references to suicide. So just to make you aware of that if you want to disengage at any point. Okay, I'm just going to set out the background then for this project and the sort of context in which we began to identify the problem that this project wants to address. So many of you will remember that in 2019 there was a parliamentary inquiry called into the reality television sector in the UK. So this was the Department of Culture, Media and Sport who launched this inquiry. And this was in the wake of some deaths by suicide of participants who had been on Love Island, the ITV reality dating show, and Jeremy Kyle, the ITV sort of conflict-centered talk show. So this was identified as a particular problem in the UK, but it's also been identified as a worldwide problem. So globally, there are increasing reports of people participating in reality television, either who die by suicide or who experience very significant sort of harms, mental health implications following their participation. And this, of course, links into a much broader public concern with and visibility of mental health. So this, yes, so it's part of this much bigger picture. So the industry responses to the parliamentary inquiry and to what was perceived as a crisis in reality television production. So the kind of industry moved quite quickly to respond to this problem, but the focus has tended to be very much on individual mental health. So how to provide mental health support to individual participants. So shows like Love Island develop new duty of care protocols. Broadcasters have appointed new senior level welfare executives. So ITV have a chief psychological officer, Channel 5 have director of contributor welfare. BBC ITV collaborating on a training programme to produce a highly qualified pool of psychologists specifically for TV. But the key point I think here is that the response has been very much on individual mental health and not thinking about working practices, not thinking about labour, not thinking about the wider context in which this is happening. I won't go too much into this. This is the kind of another angle that we're exploring in the project, but I can talk about this a bit in the Q&A. But really, what we find really interesting is that reality television participants more generally are becoming really part of sort of key actors in public discourses around mental health. So there's an increasing recognition that reality TV participation can lead to harm of mental health, but in some ways it's also leading to some sort of career opportunities and forms of media visibility for people that have been on reality television. So it's a very interesting picture, but I'll move on from that because it's not directly related to what I'm talking about today. Okay, so in response to the parliamentary inquiry and in the wake of this this sort of crisis of mental health and reality television, there was a consultation around the Ofcom's broadcasting code. So a consultation took place between 2019 and 20, and then some changes were announced in 2021, specifically about protecting participants in programming. And the changes that came about to the code were really focused on, one, informed consent, and two, risk management. So the idea of risk that Christa was talking about. So, for example, here there's a part of the code which is now which changed, saying that participants must be informed about any potential risks that will arise from their participation. And also that broadcasters should take due care over the welfare of vulnerable people who take part in the programme. So, and this people could be considered vulnerable by things like pertaining, for example, to age, their experiences, physical and mental health. So again, this very kind of individualized response to thinking about, individual people who are vulnerable and how to manage that as a risk, rather than thinking more holistically about the production context, about what infrastructures exist, that wider systemic kind of picture. This was a statement, part of a statement on the changes to the code that Ofcom published. So they said that they're seeing this rise in complaints. So Ofcom have been seeing this, very marked rise in complaints about mental health and well-being of programme participants. So in sort of unscripted TV more generally, and this reflects this growing concern about mental health. And so they state here that their objectives then were to make sure that the welfare of people who take part is protected, and to make sure audiences are protected from uncontextualized offence that can arise from seeing people on television who may be in distress or may be being bullied on screen. And I think this is very telling because Ofcom, of course, is a post-broadcast regulator. So really what their remit is to regulate content which is broadcast. They can't really actually intervene in any way to anything which, before something is broadcast. So this speaks, I think, to the limitations actually that Ofcom have in being able to address this problem of care or the lack of care in reality television. And indeed, since the code has been changed, the broadcast code's been updated with this new emphasis on the protection of participants, they haven't actually upheld complaints about Love Island, which is the sort of most visible example of this kind of problem. So they've said they put out this press release saying that, in response to the complaints that they'd had about a series of Love Island, so that and they said that they didn't uphold the complaints because in their view the show didn't portray examples of negative behaviour in a positive light. So they were broadcasting negative behaviour, but they weren't necessarily condoning it. And also the idea that there's a reasonable expectation that viewers who are watching would expect to see this kind of behaviour on screen. So again, what Ofcom are responding to here is viewers' complaints. So it's really about who complains about the show rather than about actually what happens on the show itself. That's kind of their remit as the post-broadcast regulator. Okay, so this is where we've trying to come in then with our project. So it's called Recare TV, Reality TV Working Practices and Duty of Care. So it's going to start this October and run for 3 years. And what we want to do is to think not about kind of individual risk or individual harm or individual interventions, but about thinking holistically about care. So thinking about production, thinking about participation, and thinking about policy and how these are all interconnected. And I think in a lot of the sort of public discourse around reality television and sort of harmful practices, it's that these things are very rarely considered in a sort of interconnected, holistic way. So these are the packages that run through the project, and I'll just talk through all of those in turn. So the first work package is led by Jack Newsinger at Nottingham, and this feeds very much into, links very much already, obviously, with work that Christa's done and with colleagues, and links very much with what Tiff has been talking about as well. So as we know, the production sector is characterised by freelancing, precarity, lack of union membership or agreed rates, extraordinarily long hours, bullying. Christa's already set this up actually so well already, so I don't really need to go into too much detail. But yeah, so that's the kind of context. And I should say that this Jack is partnering with Beck2 on this work package, who are going to be supporting him to do this research. So he wants to amplify the voices of production workers who were really left out of the conversations around reality television and mental health and duty of care, to think about, you know, what capacity do they actually have to be able to provide the duty of care that's required for participants, you know, to uphold this new Ofcom broadcasting code. So these are the objectives and the questions that he's going to be asking in his work package. I'm going to be looking at participation, so I'll be leading the work package, looking at people who actually participate in, contribute to reality television. And this work package will be partnering with Equity, and so obviously the Union for Performers and Creative Practitioners, and this is really addressing the concerns that I've already laid out a little bit, you know, that the fact that there is this increasing concern over the mental health implications of participating. There's very, very little existing support, guidance, advice for people who are going on to reality television. They will often have to negotiate extremely complex contractual agreements, for example, like giving up all, not having kind of performance rights, so like sort of signing away any kind of control over one's image and how that might be reused. And this is often almost all, you know, as anecdotally as at least we know that this is happening without really any kind of support or guidance. I'm also going to be looking at how participants then move into other forms of sort of similarly unregulated spaces in terms of precarious media work, like brand sponsorship on social media, OnlyFans accounts, and so on. But a key kind of thing that we're thinking about here is that, you know, people that go onto reality television are understood as contestants or contributors or participants rather than performers or rather than workers. And what would it mean to think about them as actually as you know, as laborers, as people who are performing cultural work, who are giving up their time, who are giving up, you know, who are expending lots of energy, and you know, for reality television to be making profit out of. There have been some kind of precedents of struggles over the pay and conditions and legal status. Oh, sorry, is that a time?
Oh, no, don't worry.
You sure?
Yep.
Okay, I shouldn't have too much more to go. But yeah, so this is in France a number of years ago. I think it was 2011. I haven't got the exact date here in front of me, but there was a court which ruled that participants on a reality television show should be considered as salaried staff. In Australia recently, there was a landmark ruling which stated that somebody that had appeared on a reality TV show called House Rules should be considered as a worker and therefore be you know, entitled to compensation as a worker who'd been bullied and harassed on that show. The Only Way is Essex, the stars of that show apparently threatened to boycott the ITV summer party because they found out that they were getting paid so little in comparison to other people, as, for example, actors that appear in ITV shows. So there are some kind of like precedents for thinking about what would it mean to consider reality TV participants as workers. Okay, so these are the kind of objectives and questions that I'm going to be asking on this this work package. I won't go through them all now, but happy to share this if anyone would like to have a copy of it. And these are the methods. So we'll be doing interviews with participants, 40 participants, also with agents and managers who do provide some forms of kind of guidance to certain participants. Also going to be thinking about how tracking the careers of people that have been on reality television to see what they go into, what kinds of work opportunities come about after their reality television participation. Okay, and this will feed into a report for equity, a video for people that are prospective participants, and academic stuff too. Then policy. So this is Helen Wood is going to be leading this, and she's the PI. Actually, I should have said that of the project. So she's the main person who conceived of this project and who's leading it. So policy is to think about that overall kind of policy and regulatory context. So she'll be partnering with DCMS. On this package. So thinking about how do broadcasters understand their responsibilities, how is Ofcom's changes to the broadcasting code influence decision-making practices around care, how do policies of care influence the commissioning process and beyond. So she's going to be doing with her postdoc discourse analysis of the 2019 parliamentary inquiry into reality TV. Also, there was the consultation on the Ofcom broadcasting code, and there's policy documents around that to be analysed, as well as doing interviews with commissioning execs, welfare leads, psychologists, etc. And this will feed into a report for the DCMS Select Committee. Okay, and then finally, overarching all of these three packages is the fourth one, which is around care. And this is the kind of big one which kind of wraps around everything else that we're doing. So overall, what we want to do with this project is to develop a model of care that considers in a much more holistic way the different the different kind of dimensions of reality television. So production, participation, policy, thinking about those three things together and not separately. So how can the different understandings of care be incorporated into a kind of new model of care? How should this inform discussions about mental health? Broadly, what we think needs to happen, and I think this is run through all of the papers, is to move away from a kind of individualized notion of care and duty of care and risk management to thinking about an ethic of care, a much more social understanding of care. In order to do this, we're drawing on feminist theories of care and care ethics. So beyond thinking about justice in a very individualized way, to following scholars such as Tronto and Fisher and Virginia Held to think about human dependence, the fact that that there are not just certain vulnerable individuals. Vulnerability, interdependence should be something which informs, which everybody experiences. Everybody should be responsible for one another in a kind of democratic, just society. So trying to think much more about that kind of much more moving away from thinking of duty of care to an ethic of care is what really underpins the project. So away from this kind of litigious kind of risk management kind of response, and also trying to think, because care and creativity are often thought about as kind of antithetical to one another. So if you have like more regulation around, or you have a kind of more imperatives to care for your participants, that somehow that will sort of smother the creative potential of television, and it will kind of make it less entertaining. So we're trying to think about care and creativity as something which can inform one another, and to have a form of kind of creative care as a creative strategy in and of itself. But yeah, so these are the contacts. So please do get in touch with Helen. She's currently at Lancaster. She'll be moving to Aston soon, so you can get in touch with her through either of these addresses. Jack is at Nottingham, so please get in touch with him there. I'm currently at Leicester. I will be moving to Loughborough soon, but for now you can get in touch with me at Leicester. So yeah, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from everybody. So thank you.
Marvellous. Has anybody had anything to fear? Has things to ask? Should I see? I think we'll be able to see. There's. Sorry, they can hear you.
Oh, okay, okay. Hello, hi. I hope you can hear me. So I would like to thank all of you for the for the panel, because I mean just let me have a brief introduction. So my PhD thesis focused largely on the ethical part of a reality TV, but in the context of Chinese television. And I basically wrote an entire chapter about how we should treat ordinary participants, especially the ordinary participants, maybe fairly, or and I think you have suggested a lot of options. So thank you very much for that. And also I just want to say, Jilly, I attended your conference held by WFTV 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Oh,
and that's why
yeah.
it's such a coincidence. So thank you very much, and I'm very interested in the postdoc. Yes, and so
Excellent.
I do have a question, not just one question. So I have several questions to Christa, Christa. Yes. So you have talked about freelance staff who are who are in fear of reporting any sort of bullying, and I think I just want to comment on it a little bit, because by law I think only employees can say if they were discriminated, they can take this to employment tribunal. But if you're freelance or you're contractors, unfortunately I don't think you can, unless it's unless it's something really serious. So I think maybe that's why, one of the reasons why. Yeah, I'm not sure. And there's another question. So what are the gender dimensions have you analyzed the gender dimensions in terms of workplace bullying? And also just out of my personal interest, have you done any research when it comes to the let's say with a trade union, let's say if a TV worker was bullied or discriminated or because of whistleblowing, is there a success rate? They actually got compensation in court. Finally, sorry, I know I have several questions. Finally, you talked about HR, and just drawing from my personal experience, my advice is never trust HR. And I think it's because not just the HR, but you mentioned that managers, they can be really good program makers, but it doesn't mean they can be good managers. I wonder if nepotism is a factor in it, because I have read a research about nepotism in London. So 50% of jobs, people have their jobs because of nepotism. So I just wonder whether that element was considered in your research. Sorry, I know I've asked so many questions, and yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I try and take them quickly, one at a time.
Yeah.
On the question about employment tribunals, I mean, yes, of course, people who are freelance don't have the same kind of legal protections, but I don't think they think about things like employment tribunals. What they're mainly thinking about is that you're working, you're constantly, every job is effectively an audition for your next job, because contracts are so short and there are no real legal protections. But there are places you could go, and sometimes there aren't, but sometimes there is somewhere you can go with a complaint. So people either don't complain because they don't know where they would go, because, well, the person who owns the company is the person they have the issue with, or whatever it might be. But even if there is somewhere they can go, they're very reluctant to bring an issue formally, because of the way that employment and recruitment is done. It's done so informally, and also whereas in a big company, if you're if somebody gives you a referee, and as the person employing that person, you're supposed to go to the referee who you were given, not some other random person you know knows them. But in telly, the latter happens all the time. So people are very, very worried about not getting the next gig. I think they're not thinking in the kind of advanced terms of employment tribunal. They're just thinking, I'm not getting another gig if I badmouth people on this gig. It's as simple as that. Yeah. What was the second one? Gender. Yeah, gender was a big issue. I mean, in the original State Play survey, yeah, it's a bigger issue for women than men. Surprise, surprise. It's a big issue for just about any minoritized group than for men. Surprise, surprise. Yeah, because obviously there's a whole other layer of issue that a lot of women encounter in television. Tiffany mentioned that shit things men have said to me site, you know, which is sort of case in point. So yes, we just didn't focus on it in this particular article because we were trying to look at the sort of structural issues. What was the third one?
Trade union, so success
Unions,
rate.
unions, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was interesting because actually again, we went exploring this article. One of the questions we asked in State of Play, which by the way was sponsored by Bectu, was about whether people belong to union or not, and if so, why not, and blah, blah, blah. And on the whole, there was a lot of narrative going, no, I don't, because they don't do anything useful. And if I thought they actually would speak up for me in a meaningful way, I might, but I don't think they do. It's very difficult for a union to do a great deal when you're not, again, because people aren't on long-term employment contracts, because people aren't working for big companies, because there isn't a single union representing a bunch of people, you know, in one company where there's a single union, but membership's not very high. What is interesting is there are differences across the industry, and one of the big differences is between the traditionally male working class, Tiffany, you'll recognise white male working class roles like camera operators and sound recorders and so forth, and sparks. There are roles which where people charge Bec2 rates and people pay them Bec2 rates, and they expect to work the hours contracted and to get overtime if they don't work the hours contracted. And there are a great many roles to whom that does not apply. So there's a very weird kind of apartheid system goes on across in terms of union representation. It works for some roles and not others. I mean, one of the important things is there is a background. If you go back to the 70s, British television was highly unionized. Nobody could pick up a light bulb without the right person did it, and blah, blah, blah. And so in a way, we've come to a sort of backlash that's gone so far the other way that, yeah, there's just a few roles that are meaningfully unionized, but most people aren't. And part of that is cultural, because actually, if somebody were to leave a company or to refuse a contract or to walk out of a production who was a camera operator, that production would probably find it quite difficult to replace them, because there'd be that informal network going, don't touch them. Whereas if somebody did that as a researcher or an assistant producer or something, then there's a queue of 15 people who say, I don't care, and they're just going to step into that role. I mean, obviously I simplify slightly, but that's sort of broadly how it operates. Was there another one?
Yes, so nepotism.
Yes, loads. Next.
You would like to ask something? Anyone?
Hi. Thanks, Tiffany, Christa, and Jilly. You're very interesting papers. I can't help but say with Christa and Tiffany's paper, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was having. You could change a few words here, and we're talking about academia, but it was for another time. I did have a couple of questions for Jilly. Firstly, I could very quickly, but you said you might have more to say about this kind of genre of reality stars and other celebrities as well. You know, give perspective and visibility to their mental health issues. So I'd love to hear any thoughts on that, because it's just, this program has intrigued me. And secondly, I wonder if when looking at attitudes and reality stars and the way that they've been and the way that they are treated, is how much do you think the kind of cultural attitudes and snobbery and elitism towards reality TV are at play here? And in particular, I can't help but bring up, there was an ITV advertising campaign where it would have a drama actor trying to kill, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, a reality star. I mean, they were quite good adverts, really, but the subtext was a dramatic actor would really think little of a reality star. So I just wondered how kind of more general cultural attitudes and snobbery towards reality is at play.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and be as concise as possible for those two questions. Thank you. I guess in terms of the sort of visibility of reality TV stars as kind of ambassadors for mental health or sort of advocates for mental health campaigns, I guess that is something that we haven't really fully worked out yet, but we're really interested in it, particularly for what kind of reality TV stars get to have those opportunities to have those quite kind of high profile kind of, you know, like BBC documentaries on you know, body image and or mental health. So there's the question about, you know, who gets those opportunities to have those fairly kind of quite prestigious kind of opportunities. The other thing that we're interested in is that the kind of things that we see, the sort of the documentaries, the social media posts about kind of mental health struggles, often it's kind of on the one hand, it's sort of destigmatizing mental health struggles in a way that could be seen as pretty positive and progressive, but it's also sort of feeding into this kind of resilience culture about, you know, individuals kind of heroically overcoming their mental health struggles on their own. So I think it's part of that kind of very hyper individualized way that we tend to think about mental health. So that's the kind of interest that we have in that, and we might kind of explore that as a kind of maybe a kind of side project attached to this. I think the question about class and judgment around reality television as a genre and how that's feeding into this is absolutely key. So not, you know, and there's a very interesting history to this where, you know, reality television emerged as what Andrew Ross points out. It was called a kind of scab genre because it emerged in the US as a way of kind of undercutting unionized labor in other sectors of television. So it kind of comes already with that kind of sort of scab genre status. So there's that feeding into it. But yeah, also absolutely, I think trying to get people to understand that people on reality television could be considered or should be considered as workers who are, you know, who are dedicating their time and toil is very difficult because of these wider cultural assumptions that they are narcissists, or they're just kind of fame hungry, or you know, this is not real work. You know, so you often get these discourses of, you know, this isn't real work, this is just people lying around in bikinis, or you know, whatever it might be. So I guess I would just agree with your point there that I think those assumptions, ideas, imaginaries about reality television are sort of part of the problem, really, of recognizing that, you know, they are people that are giving up a huge amount of time, you know, with no protections, you know, no sick pay, you know, things like that. So yeah, so I think I would just agree that's a big part of the problem. But thank you for the question.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Beth Johnson.
Thank you. Just to say, this has been an amazing panel. Thank you so much to all of the speakers. I've got a question for Tiff, if I can. The PhD sounds absolutely fantastic. I'm so interested in looking at the, you know, results when they're done. You mentioned at one point that sort of there was this moment of hope, and then, you know, and then perhaps a very short time in which people felt more empowered, and then things very quickly went back to either normal, or if indeed can return to that, or perhaps worse. And I was just wondering if you mentioned at one point that there was somebody who was essentially doing the work of 3 people, and therefore they couldn't leave. And I'm wondering if what else happened in that period, and I asked this from a position of total naivety, was that people were required to multi-skill even more. So not to do 3 times their own work, but also to suddenly be experts in other people's work as well. And I've been sort of thinking about that in terms of, I suppose, other elements of the industry, but I didn't know if it was relevant at all to maybe what you'd found or not.
Yeah, I think that was the case in that people were being asked to do just roles that weren't even within their repertoire of skills. But I also think that speaks to within costume generally, costume is seen as ranked as unskilled, that it's more akin to shopping, and that, oh, well, if you don't want to do the job, someone gave a quote that they were told if they didn't want to do the job, the producer would get his girlfriend to go out and do it. That kind of devaluing of women's work. And so when people were asked to take on these roles that actually, so as a costume maker, I am not skilled, really, I wouldn't say, to be a costume standby, which is someone on set checking continuity and that kind of thing. I'm a maker, I sit at a sewing machine. That is a completely different skill set. But at the same time, people were just being asked to do whatever, it didn't matter. I don't know whether that happened in other departments where because they're more respected, then they were asked to suddenly just pick up a new skill set. But yeah, generally, and then so there's a historic devaluation of costume work in the sense that there's this big debate over whether costume work is actually classed as skilled. So most of us have a degree or some kind of tertiary education, but we are told we cannot demand the same rates as other departments because we are unskilled. So yeah, so that kind of thing, it was just sort of, you figure it out, there's this problem, you figure it out, it's your responsibility to plug these gaps, when actually really that shouldn't have happened, and that wasn't really, that's just sort of just again shows the disrespect of, you don't understand what we're doing really, because costume making is a completely different skill to being on set with a costume. But there's people's ignorance, and I could go on for days, but there was sort of amongst my participants, they would excuse people for being asked, for people putting on them. They would say, oh, well, they don't understand, you know, it's not their fault. They don't really understand what we do, you know, and we should have spoken that back. There was sort of this internalization and self-blame. Oh, we should have stood up for ourselves a bit more. So it was the sort of this weird circle of being devalued and then accepting that devaluedness because, you know, what else are we going to do anyway? Because everyone thinks we're extraneous, that we're not useful, we're just extras to the production anyway, we're frilly. You know, that was kind of, yeah, it's negative, disappointing and frustrating.
Thank you, everyone. It's really super interesting. I mean, 2 pages of notes that I'm going to sort of go away and look at. So thank you for being sort of so informative and enlightening. My question is also for Tiffany. It's mainly that the presentation hinted at this really interesting kind of political economy context, if I understood this right, which is sort of platforms and this increased churn of content and increased demand for content. And I was just kind of interested to hear more about that really, and whether how much that kind of shows up as a context for these changing working practices and how the people you interviewed kind of narrated their working conditions.
Yeah, a kind of churn of content at the same time. So in the background of a lot of the mentality of a lot of my participants was like, oh, we're replaceable, you know, like if I step to the side, okay, it's a bit like what Christa was saying, that can you replace a camera operator in the same way? There's another willing costume maker to step into my shoes. But what happened when the skill shortages happened, it was this sort of sudden light bulb moment, especially because things were happening on Instagram. It felt like a moment, even though it didn't turn out to be one. So it kind of galvanized these ideas and oh, we're now worth something. We're not just these sort of replaceable workers that if I'm sick, someone will stand in my shoes tomorrow anyway, because who cares if I lack of care generally. Who cares if I step away because I'm replaceable? But yeah, with the churn of content, although I guess content became this sort of devalued, let's chuck out lots of content. and people became dissatisfied with the actual work they were doing because they were being rushed and like, multiple people's role, work became very unenjoyable. At the same time, it weirdly made workers more valuable because there was fewer of them. And then now what we've seen again is that this cycle where content creation has died down, and now workers are all vying for the same jobs, so we're all not valuable anymore. So this sort of mind fuck of the industry that you go around in cycles and cycles, and that's why it's like I have that picture of a fuzzy cloud, because you don't know whether you're coming or going, and everything sort of changes from one job to another. So you just sort of live in this fuzz, and nothing ever changes because you're too tired at the end of the day.
Thank you, it's really interesting.
Jilly, did you want to respond, or did you have your hand up?
I did, but I think Christa had her hand up first.
Oh, sorry, I didn't spot that. Christa?
I was just going to chip in there because I think that with two things. One was with Tiffany was talking about, the devaluation of women's work, and Rowan and I have been working together on a project around production managers recently, who are also almost always women, and similar kind of principles about the way that work done by women is somehow devalued, almost because it's being done by women, you sometimes feel, and that idea of skills not being recognised. A lot of the stuff you're saying, Tiffany, very interesting, being echoed there. But I also want to pick up on what you were saying about this very odd business of the high churn of content, and across the industry there has been an impact of that skill shortage. I always find it quite amusing. Employers complain about a thing called show jumping, nothing to do with horses. People buggering off before the end of a contract because they got a better offer, and they're absolutely outraged when people do this, which I find quite amusing because they don't seem to see it problem the other way around. But when somebody can actually get better wage and dares to go somewhere else, don't like it at all. But you're quite right that that sort of dying down now, but you're also quite right that it has a weird mixed effect, because it does mean that there are people who are actually being promoted very fast, sometimes not a good thing. It does mean there are people, going, well, this is a better offer, and having these range of options because there are fewer of them, particularly in certain roles. But it also, sometimes for the same people, sometimes for other people, has meant that people are on productions where, apparently we can't get a production coordinator, we can't get a whatever buyer, whatever it is, so could you just do that as well as your job? So it backfires as well. It can play both ways, I think, just as you say.
And I just wanted to add to that point. So Vanessa Jackson did a presentation of doing women's film and TV history last month, where she spoke about costume design. So she showed a video of a costume designer who was discussing the way in which cameramen and lighting men were able to take an hour and a half to reframe a shot, whereas they would be given 15 minutes, and someone would be rapping on the porta cabin door. So it's about inducting this culture throughout the whole of the set as very hierarchical and extremely gendered, and the way in which that is just reproduced throughout the industry, across the genre as well. But Jilly, you were going to say something else.
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah, so I was just going to ask Tiff, I suppose, about well, because as Tiff was talking, I was just thinking about how this echoes just much more widely, or kind of what's gone on in kind of the labour force and the relations between labour and employers and capitalism since COVID, in this sort of initial sort of surge of hope and optimism that maybe there's a balance of power was coming back to the workers, as we saw with things like, the Clap for Carers initiative, this kind of idea that we were suddenly going to recognise and value key workers, and then that kind of melting away, and then actually things have got a lot worse. And so I'm just thinking about, like, wondering how you sort of see it as part of that wider context, and also this kind of phenomenon of what's sometimes known as like the Great Resignation or quiet quitting, where people seem to be becoming increasingly disenchanted with work and kind of withdrawing from it, but not in a particularly sort of collective, organized kind of, labor movementy kind of way, but in a much more kind of like individualized kind of just sort of being resigned to the terribleness of work, rather than trying to think that it could be sort of collectively transformed. So I just wondered if Tiff, if you had any thoughts about how this fits into like that bigger picture.
Yeah, I think definitely like post COVID, and that was where a lot of the rhetoric was coming from. In my interviews at the beginning of 21 about this sort of turn to care and, oh, you know, things might change and bullying, harassment training and all of that. So it was definitely sort of a response. Participants were so influenced by the wider ideas that came during 2020. What's the other thing I was going to say? But the thing with individual responses to systemic problems is that, yeah, a lot of people were just jumping ship, like there was crew poaching. And then they had an interesting case of one participant who was crew jumping. Everyone never wanted to be seen as crew jumping because crew jumping ship, because then you were given a bad reputation. That still kind of functioned in the background. But what one participant was saying is like, oh, well, actually, I jumped to a production that had Wonderworks connected to it, and they were offering me free childcare for my child the rest of the production. So of course I jumped to the thing, and now it's okay. Now it's acceptable. Now that's probably not the case anymore because it's all died down and everything. But again, and so one of the things I talk about in my PhD is this an example of agency, like where workers are exerting some kind of control or power by leaving. But at the end of the day, mass resignations is, you know, we're still going round in circles. That's not leading to anything. So the ones that do stay, the ones that the women I interviewed that had like 20-year careers, they are staying, they are trying to do something. So they're the ones that are invested in it. And I would say the ones that are kind of mid-level, like mid-career, 5 to 7 years in, they're just sort of like, this isn't worth my shit. Like, this is, well, why am I doing this? Why am I killing myself? And so you get nothing. It was such a mixed bag in the sense that you get some people, they would leave for a few months, but they would be drawn back in like it was a drug. They were like, oh, what the hell am I going to do instead? Like, I'm really trained in this and I actually earn good money here, so I'm just going to suck it up and stay. So you have this sort of mass resignation, and then this sort of return was a trend. People would just come back a few months later. So I'm quitting, I don't like it, so it's a load of shit, I don't want to do it anymore. And then they'd come back a few months later because actually, what are they going to do? Like work in Tesco or something like this? They're not trained to do anything else. So yes, it was this mass resignation, and then coming back like, oh, just fuck it, like this is the way it is.
But that also speaks to the status, the relative status of TV, and even, you know, the way in which people stand punitive conditions because the status it gives them outside of the job, and you know, it makes it very, very difficult for people to leave often because they're not going to get often a better paid job, even if they do have to kill themselves together. Sorry, are there any more questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, hi. This one is for Jilly. So I've noticed that I've taken some photos that you mentioned policies, and you have 3 research questions, and then you outlined your methods, 30 interviews with senior executives, part of report for DCMS select committee, and discourse analysis. I just wonder, I'm asking this question because my research with my PhD, I did ethnographic research. So it was participant observation and passive observation. And I specifically did ethnography because one thing I realized in the field was that when you ask people questions, they sometimes don't have an answer. And like they have to either just say they don't know, or they just make up an answer, or really it's like that's why I think observation and being part of it is very important. So so anyway, my question is, what do you think are the limitations, if I may, of your current research? Or and if you do realize there are limitations, are there like any other methods that you think of, you know, incorporating in your research? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's a very important question, and something that we've thought and talked about a lot. So that package is going to be led by Helen Wood. So she'll be the one doing interviews and policy analysis with her postdoc. My research with participants is going to be it's designed as a kind of mostly interview based research. obviously we recognise the limitations of that for partly because of the reasons that you've just outlined. We do have we had some issues around access, about getting access, also time. I'm going to be doing this alongside my other responsibilities, so it's not like we're going to have like a big blocks of time to be able to do a kind of very in-depth ethnography, which would be great. I agree. One of the things that we're thinking about doing, because recognizing that interviews may be quite difficult for some people to do, particularly in terms of identifying themselves, wanting to remain anonymous, and even though of course we will adhere to all those ethical imperatives and keep our sources anonymous, but nonetheless those hesitations might remain. So we're actually thinking about doing what Christa was talking about as an open-ended questionnaire. So it's very interesting to hear about the particular challenges that brings, is that you then get a kind of overabundance of data, and what do you do with that? But that's, so we are still kind of like thinking about our methods, within the constraints that we have, within the time that we have. But so we are thinking about ways of being able to hear participants' voices, and maybe in different ways. So so there are issues around, we recognize the constraints, and this is something we're going to be actively reflecting on, but that's very useful, and it's really that's really great. And I'd really appreciate reading your research, if you wouldn't mind sending it to me. That would be great.
Sure.
To kind of
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have to stop there. I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you. And yeah.
Thank you.